So let's talk a little bit more about like how you would add a new resource to Alchemy. Because I mean, this is a thing. People are going to discover like, okay, great. Like I wanted to do this thing for my infrastructure. You know, maybe
Hmm.
Oxide Computer Company comes like, hey, we want to build an Oxide thing for for Alchemy. So how would they get started? Like, what does it look like to model a resource in Alchemy? And yeah, I guess you just mentioned that it's like just a function to create, update, delete infrastructure, but like how do you sort of like make sure things are in the right state, and what does all that look like?
Right. So the general shape of a resource is there's properties, which are what you input when you configure, and then there's output attributes. It's what they're called in CloudFormation, or you could call them output properties. So you simply just think about your resource in terms of an input output contract. It's like, okay, what do I need to provide as part of the configuration? And what do I expect back from that? Right. And so that's just two interfaces, my properties and my output, or the resource instance. And then you declare a function, and there's a very light wrapper around the function where you give it a what I call the FQN, or a globally unique name or type name, up to you what you want to call it. But it's like an identifier for this resource type. So all instances of this resource can be associated with the handler, right? And then you just provide a function that takes in the current state, an ID for that resource. For example, my website needs to be unique within a scope, which we can talk about later, and then the properties. And then it's a function that just needs to handle three cases. One is the create case, which is this resource doesn't exist. It's the first I've heard of it. What do I do in that case? Maybe I call post instead of put, for example, right? Then there's the update phase, which is the properties have changed, but the resource already exists. So you have access to the current state of the resource. Maybe you need to write a bit of logic to, for example, in Cloudflare, and notice which bindings I need to remove because they're no longer there, and make a call specifically to that. And then finally, there's the delete phase, right? Which is, how do I clean this thing up reliably? And this usually it's pretty simple. Like it's post, put, delete. If the REST API is designed well, it mostly maps to the REST call. Like REST is a resourceful design of resources. Post for create, put for update, delete for delete. The best resources work this way. Stripe, for example, took me 1 minute to generate because they're just perfect REST resources. AWS is in a very similar boat. And then there's like a sort of the edge cases, right? Which is most resources are eventually consistent. So especially ones that have a heavy back, like you spin up a VPC, Amazon's got some waiting periods before it propagates and stuff like that. So you'll usually want to at least think about those up front and be, okay, when I update, maybe I want to wait a few seconds and then do a check and make sure it's consistent so that the consumer of my resource is guaranteed that it's consistent. Or maybe I'm like, no, I'm okay with providing an eventual consistent layer so that things can move along quicker, and then resolve consistency down later. So those are some important things to consider. And finally, I guess the other one is you want it to be idempotent. It's usually better that like if I run the resource and then something kind of bugs out in the middle of it and then I run it again, I don't want to be bricked. Like being bricked from a partial state is terrible. Like they should, if I run this multiple times, it should get to the same state. That's a really important point. So with those in mind, and these are all encoded in the cursor rules file, by the way, you can mostly just take the API spec, paste it in, prompt, and you'll get most of it. And then you'll use it a few times by running the tests and find the edges and repair them as you find them.
Something you just said there, I want to dig more into. The homepage of Alchemy even calls it out that it's optimized for Gen AI. I really want to know, like, what does that mean in like terms of API design? What does that mean in terms of like things you deliver to the user to like make that possible? Like you just mentioned a cursor rules file. Like
Mhm.
I've never used one of those so far. How does that fit into the workflow? How does it make like code that is always right? Like, can you just dig into that a little more?
Yeah, so the main thing that's working there is the cursor rules file, right? So because it's just a function and it's just TypeScript and I have a nice fleshed out pattern, right? I think one of the things we were going to talk about is what does AI change, like made me think more about in development. It's definitely patterns and conventions, right? if you let AI go ham on something, it will go ham, especially Claude 3.7 Sonnet. It'll just build random stuff, right? But if you establish a really, really constrained convention, it's extremely productive. Like we're talking taking hours or days of work and reducing it to minutes. So if you compare the development of a custom resource in Alchemy to, say, Pulumi or Terraform, like I would consider a custom resource in Pulumi or Terraform as a project. It's not just a new function. There are so many gotchas and things that are not obvious to the LLM because there's like, okay, a Terraform is a Go project with a provider that you need to publish and build and structure in a certain way. Right? It's a big deal. It's like building a service more than it is like building a function. So in that way, generating a service is a lot harder for AI than generating a function, for example. Pulumi also has lots of edges. Like, for example, if you use ESM, it'll just bug out. Like they're running like weird compiler stuff on your resource, which I think is a mistake, but that comes with gotchas that the AI just doesn't understand. And there are also minimum two pieces. There's the resource and there's the resource handler. So two pieces is always worse than one, where Alchemy is just pure type safe function with an established convention that can be spat out by an AI. So that is like optimized for AI. I'm also, because it's now it's pure TypeScript, I've started experimenting with integrating the Vercel AI SDK into it and building resources around AI. So you can flesh out a workflow that like generates code and it'll only recompute a file if its upstream dependencies have changed. For like, thinking like, oh, I import this file. Well, when the file that I import changes, I probably should think about recomputing and updating this file. But if it doesn't change, don't do anything, right? So that's the other angle that I'm experimenting. That's way more speculative. I'm doing that to generate my docs, for example. Some of my docs are being generated this way. So whenever I change the implementation, it automatically updates the docs and thinks about new use cases for that. That's pretty cool. I think there's a lot more that can be done there, but prompt engineering is hard and time consuming, and I'm not there yet. But that's the AI story at the moment.
I wonder about so I think, I don't know, it's interesting to think of you, like, are you working alone right now? Or are you sort of solo on this?
Yeah, totally.
Okay. It's an interesting thing about someone solo, like working on an infrastructure as a code product, because like classically, I think of this as such a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because for it to be really useful, you have to cover such a broad swath of area, like we've discussed, and like you've like kind of talked about like how Gen AI is like making this a lot more possible to you. And I'm curious, like, how are you thinking about how this shapes building a company around, something like Alchemy? So, you were talking about like Terraform. So when HashiCorp was building Terraform, you just need hands-on keyboard. You need a pretty significant team to like bootstrap this and get it to a real point. And then, the pressure to get like salespeople and get big contracts and like the shape of the business is really driven by the fact that like you have to like put some real accelerant here, raise a lot of money or something to get this like product really going, because this is almost like this network effects that you have. But like, so you have this like emergent sort of new property of development that means you can do a lot more with a lot less effort. And also you're trying to like constrain the abstractions and make it simpler to work on the product to begin with. So it's like, as you're thinking about like growing the product and building a team around this, like, where's your head at? Like, I don't know. Like, what does that look like to you?
It's a great question. My head is definitely not there right now. My head is at, can I build the best product possible right now? Being solo means I've got plenty of time, flexibility, and runway to just focus on building the best product. And I'm definitely not in a rush to ruin the product by trying to monetize something that really shouldn't be monetized. But I think, I'm sort of biding my time. And I guess my strategy is, well, if Alchemy becomes the root of applications, right? The root of the future of applications, all infrastructure declared in Alchemy programs, and a community comes around and helps build out that base. And some of these AI stories start to evolve, and LLMs, we get another jump like we got from GPT to 3.5 Sonnet, or another jump to 3.7. As those things improve, on the side, eventually I'll be in a great position to move into what is looking like a personal software era, right? Where people For example, I was talking to a guy who has a problem with calendars, like one of the oldest problems in the world, and it's still a problem, right? And it's mostly because no calendar fits his needs. So he wants to generate personal software. I think Alchemy could evolve, or an adjacent product could evolve into that, where now I start focusing on not just the infrastructure problems. Infrastructure is solved, and then I up level and apply the same scalable practices that I did for like conventionalizing infrastructure, so that AI can generate 90% of it. I could apply the same to another thing I've been experimenting with is event-driven systems, domain-driven design, and get into the actual application space. And then that could become I point to Lovable and Bolt.new as good examples, but I think this space is going to change rapidly. And they're sort of building from the top down is my general vibe, and I'm building from the bottom up.